Okay, our guest this evening is Mr. Milt Diggins. Milt is an independent scholar, author, public historian, and lecturer. He retired after teaching history for most of his 32-year career. Milt edited the Cecil County Historical Journal, a publication of the Historical Society of Cecil County, Maryland, for 8 years, and wrote numerous history articles for that publication and for a local newspaper. The Maryland Historical Magazine published his 2006 article about the political and engineering effort to construct the first railroad bridge across the mouth of the Susquehanna River. And in 2008, his first book, Images of America, Cecil County, was published. He has also authored research on Underground Railroad sites for the National Park Service's program to verify and designate authentic Underground Railroad sites. His 2016 book, Stealing Freedom Along the Mason-Dixon Line, published by the Maryland Historical Society, uses the story of an Elkton slave catcher and kidnapper to frame a larger story of slave catching and kidnapping in the region around the time of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Please welcome Mr. Milt Diggins.
Thank you. All right, to begin the story, stealing freedom along the Mason-Dixon line, Thomas McCreary, the notorious slave catcher from Maryland, seemed to be just one character among many who was kind of had a dual identity of slave catcher and kidnapper. Sometimes they weren't even sure. They didn't really care. But it turns out he was much more significant. I spent 7 years of research and writing to put this story together because it turns out that it ties into so much that illustrates just what was going on at the time before the Civil War. Now, just look at this area that we all are living in, this Baltimore-Wilmington-Philadelphia corridor. In Philadelphia, you had a Center for Abolitionist Activity and Assistance for Fugitives. In Wilmington, you had Thomas Garrett and a very active Underground Railroad. In Baltimore, it was a major slave trading port. So, and in between Baltimore and Philadelphia, exactly between the two, is Cecil County, Maryland, equidistant. And so when you look at this area, what you have here, you have abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates, slaveholders and pro-slavery advocates, freedom seekers, slave catchers, informers, kidnappers, kidnapped victims, free blacks, self-defense leagues, enslaved, slave dealers, and regular citizens who got pulled into events whether they wanted to or not. And this obviously is an explosive mixture within this radius, or this corridor. Now, Pennsylvania and Maryland particularly became quite bitter in their arguments about slave catching and kidnapping. From Pennsylvania's point of view, slaveholders have a right to recover a slave, but due process should be followed to protect the rights of the accused. You're going to accuse somebody of being a fugitive, take them before a judge, lay out your evidence, explain why you're taking this person, want to take this person. Kidnapping is the seizing of an accused fugitive or free citizen and removing the person from the state without due process. You grab them, you head for the state border, and that's it. And that's kidnapping. That's obvious kidnapping. Now, from the Maryland point of view, they didn't see it that way at all. First of all, slave catching in another state is a constitutional right. How dare you question a constitutional right? The Supreme Court has ruled. You have upheld in Brigg versus Pennsylvania, 1842, a slave catcher can go into a northern state and they are not to be hindered in recovering their property. And that is Maryland's position. period. Kidnapping? Depends on the situation. We'll tell you whether or not we think it's kidnapping. Yeah. Now, from 1848 to 1851, Thomas McCreary seized at least 9 people in Pennsylvania and Delaware that we have a record of. Maryland considered the Pennsylvania incidents legal arrest, ignored the Delaware incidents, as did Delaware, and protected McCreary as a valued slave catcher. Pennsylvania governors questioned his methods of arrest, in quotes, and requested his extradition 3 times for obvious kidnappings. So you have this sharp division between the 2 states. From Maryland's view, Thomas McCreary is a villainous kidnapper, or at least he should be tried as such. From the Maryland point of view, you're talking about a heroic slave catcher. You're talking about a bold defender of Maryland property rights. What are you talking about, Pennsylvania? He's protecting Maryland property rights. Now, in between these 2 arguments, you have a gray area. And that gray area is where the kidnappers exploited these murky distinctions between legal arrest and kidnappings by ignoring due process. And the Constitution allowed them to do so, according to the Supreme Court. And by abducting free blacks and selling them into the slave market. Now, the first case I came across from McCreary, and this building still exists, this was the, until recently, the library in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. There was a group of kidnappers, Thomas McCreary among them, that just before dawn rode up in a carriage in front of this house. One stayed at the carriage, several of the other men went to the back, broke through the door in the back, went straight to the 3rd floor because they knew exactly where the fugitives were going to be, because there were informers in town that had sent word down to them and given this information to the gang. This was an Elkton gang. And they went right to the 3rd floor. There was a mother and daughter. The daughter was 16. The mother was already awake, and she was able to avoid the kidnappers. The daughter was still sound asleep when this big brute of a man grabs her, and she suddenly finds herself awakened in the arms of this character, this person, this thug, and she's being taken down the steps. Now, at the 2nd floor, one of the daughters of the homeowner opens the door to see what all the ruckus and noise is about. She sees this, she screams, she slams the door shut again while the kidnappers are still going down the steps. The homeowner runs out in his nightshirt and tries to confront the kidnappers, and one of the kidnappers pulls out a gun, points it at his head and says, "You interfere and we'll blow your brains out." And then they rush the 16-year-old girl, throw her into the carriage, the waiting carriage, and they head out for the state line. The homeowner dresses, he tries to catch up to him, he gets to Westchester and told he's about a half hour behind him, and he's not sure whether they're going to Delaware or Maryland or what route or what. So he gives up pursuit. However, well, let's take a look at what happened here. First of all, many Pennsylvanians, like the editor of the Village Record in Westchester, saw this as a kidnapping. How many of you think of this as a kidnapping? How many would agree this is a kidnapping? All right, obviously you're not in Maryland at the time period. Home is invaded in the early morning hours. No warrant is presented. They did not give a warrant. Occupants are terrorized. The life of the homeowner is threatened. The 16-year-old girl is abducted. And the abductors do not go before a judge. They go straight for the state line. Now, Marylanders saying, "What do you mean a kidnapping? How dare you call it a kidnapping?" The editor of the Cecil Whig saw it as a legal arrest of a fugitive slave. The Cecil Whig editor blamed Pennsylvania for the gang's actions. The law-defying spirit of the citizens and authorities of that state have made it almost, if not entirely, impossible to bring a slave from Pennsylvania. In the law-defying spirit, they're referring to things like the Pennsylvania's Personal Liberty Law, 1847, the abolitionists and anti-Quaker agitators, anti-slavery agitators, and the Quakers, the African Americans who were actively involved. Citizens, they were also upset with the citizens who were assisting the escapes, the fugitives. Slaveholders are jealous of the rights guaranteed them by law. Large rewards will prompt fearless men to eminent risk. Arrest or outrages, if you please to call them so, will follow. Blood and death may deepen them into fearful tragedies. And for all the consequences, the people of Pennsylvania will be held accountable. It's all their fault. If they didn't obstruct, we wouldn't have to use these methods. Their executive may demand from ours, the offenders. The demand will be as idle as the wind. They will not be delivered up. And those words will ring true all the way through this. As they have substantially legalized the decoying of slaves away, the arresting of them by force will be sustained. Let Pennsylvania ponder, and instead of idly ranting, take proper steps to remedy evils for which they are responsible. Now, as it turns out, by the way, there's a network among Quakers. There were Quakers in Baltimore who routinely would check slave pens, look for people that may have been kidnapped. Evidently, word got down from Downingtown to contacts in Baltimore, and then so they found the girl. Someone from Downingtown came down. The people of Downingtown, they raised this money for the girl's freedom. And then when the girl was returned, the girl and mother headed straight for Canada. Now in Chester County, those dots are incidents that Thomas McCreary was involved in. He's just one. Now he worked with different gangs, but we're talking about just one slave catcher kidnapper, the career of one for a certain period of time. And this is just the visible part. Also, you notice that, Chestnut Level's on there because it was a small village where some Pennsylvania authorities tried to arrest McCreary during the a trial that was conducted after the Christiana incident. And McCreary was able to evade the capture. Christiana, you notice that it's in Lancaster County, but it's pretty close to the Chester County line. And Christiana is going to play an important role in this as well. The aftermath of Christiana will play an important role. Christiana was the most violent reaction to, or resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. There were several incidents in Delaware as well that I'll mention, and there were incidents and trials in Philadelphia and Baltimore that were related to either McCreary or to Cecil County, to McCreary's community. And the community, by the way, McCreary was politically tied in with the political bosses of the county, so that provided a little extra protection for him. Now in Downingtown, you have a second kidnapping, the kidnapping of Henry Lee Brown. If you saw 12 months a slave, it's the same deception. We have a job for you. This was a black-white team. Solomon States and McFarland. And McFarland had gone to Philadelphia. So I'm going to go down to Philadelphia, line up a job for you. Solomon States stayed back and was talking to Brown and saying, you know, he's going to get a good job for you. Wait, go to Philadelphia. Brown was looking for something new. He's 17 years old. anxious to do something different. He had been working for an local employer since about the time he was 9. And so he's enticed to go down to Philadelphia. Well, when he gets there, the story changes. McFarland says, oh, it's my uncle. My uncle needs a carriage driver down in Wilmington. And you're 17, you're African American, your prospects beyond the farm are kind of limited. This idea of working for a carriage, being a carriage driver sounds kind of nice. So they get on the train and they start to head down towards Wilmington, and all of a sudden, at the next stop, still in Philadelphia, they stop the train. Brown gets off, he balks. Suddenly, for some reason, he decides he does not want to go to Wilmington. Now, whether or not he overheard something, or it started sinking in that he was heading to a slave state, and maybe that's not a great idea. But he balked, so he gets off. The two men follow him and try to persuade him. They say, come on, let's talk some more. In the meantime, they call two more friends of theirs, one of which is Thomas McCreary. He came up from Milton. He's in Philadelphia, and he's trying to help persuade him. And so when that's not working, McCreary pulls out a gun, and with force of arms, as the indictment will later say, he will force Brown to travel with them. They go on past Wilmington, and they head right to Baltimore, and Brown is sold as a slave, although he was a free black. Fortunately for Brown, he was well-spoken. He was able to give evidence. He was talking to slave there. He explained that he had an employer up in Downingtown, that he was free. The slave dealer, now what you have to understand about the slave dealers is they're walking both sides of this fence. On one hand, they have to look like they're a perfectly legitimate business doing the right thing, step by step, following the law. But on the other hand, that's not particularly true. They're involved in some of this themselves. But they have to look honest, they have to look legitimate. So in this particular case, Campbell, the slave dealer, decides, well, I better check. And he writes a letter to the person he claimed to be an employer, and the gentleman by the name of Evans says, oh yeah, and he came down and he was able to rescue Brown out of what would have been a trip south and enslavement for the rest of his life. Now the Downingtown kidnappers are in prison for kidnapping. McCreary and his accomplice, however, they're off. They're gone. Now, one of the accomplices also had a trial, but he got acquitted. McCreary's down. McCreary's busy. He's planning his next kidnapping or his next slave-catching episode, whichever way it's interpreted here. An indictment was sent out for McCreary. Well, yeah, indictment, I'm getting ahead of myself, but an indictment will come out. Near Unionville, 1849, the arrest of Thomas Mitchell, and I have arrest in quotes for a reason. Mitchell is a tenant farmer. According to Mitchell's story, he had been a limited term slave. He lived in Maryland for 12 years. He served as a slave, and he finished his term and left Maryland after finishing his term. But here they're claiming that he's a fugitive. Now here's what happens. A gang comes up in the middle of the night. McCreary's working with a different group. McCreary's fluid. He keeps working with different groups of different gangs. They take a log, they crash into the tenant house at midnight. They go in, they grab Mitchell, they start pulling him from the bed. The wife is frantic. She grabs at her husband, trying to keep him from taking him. It's quite violent. They manage to get Mitchell out and throw him in the carriage. In order to calm the wife down, if you want to call this calming down, they put a gun to her head and threatened to blow her brains out, but she's still continuing to sob. So one of the thugs puts his elbow or either his hand and tries to or strangles her until she's quiet. She falls to the floor. Later, when neighbors came rushing in later, just as the gang had already left, they found a pistol on the floor with an exploded cap that evidently it didn't fire, so evidently they actually did try to shoot her. Mitchell is taken straight down to Baltimore. Again, no trial, no one before a judge in Pennsylvania. Straight to Baltimore. There's conflicting claims. Somebody, McCreary saying, I did this for an owner who said Mitchell escaped from him. There's no warrant. And Mitchell purchased the supposed owner by, Mitchell's purchased by the supposed owner by Mitchell while on the run. Now this is another trick they used. The so-called slave owner, the person who's claiming to own him, claiming to own Mitchell, sells him to McCreary. McCreary heads down to Baltimore. The slave dealer says, "Do you have proof of ownership?" "Oh yeah, here's the bill of sale. I just bought it." That's all the slave dealer needs as proof. They don't. The state of Maryland did not expect the slave dealers to go traipsing all over the state to verify property claims. The bill of sale gave cover for McCreary. Now what happens here for the community, they're alarmed for Mitchell. And they go rushing off in two places. One group goes to Wilmington, contacts Garrett and says, telegraph down to Baltimore, they're probably heading for Baltimore, and they were right. They have some people in Baltimore watching as the train comes in. The group that goes to Baltimore also tries to protect Mitchell. Well, the farmer that Mitchell worked for, Martin, a gentleman by the name of Martin, he makes a claim that Mitchell was free, but the next thing he knows, Martin is arrested. He's being sued by the so-called previous owner who said, well, you stole all that labor from me, and therefore he's being sued. Fortunately, there was an honest judge involved here who says, well, you're going to have to go to Pennsylvania to sue this suit that was incurred in Pennsylvania. And would be no surprise the supposed owner never went to Pennsylvania to do that, make it a claim. They had a protest meeting afterwards. What they recalled an indignation meeting. Excuse me. And they complained about the fugitive slave laws of that time. This is before 1850. And they're complaining about the laws and the way that these slave catchers and kidnappers were coming into their towns and terrorizing and using violence and just grabbing people. And it seemed that they're just grabbing them at random. The community donates the money to buy Mitchell's freedom. As one of the residents wrote, excuse me, though neighbors raised the money to buy Tom's freedom, one local resident felt he was as likely to be kidnapped again as ever, for I do not believe any of them is safe. There's a great many would steal a Negro for $600 rather than go to work, provided the law did not get hold of them. All right, in the meantime, the Maryland governor, taking his time, decides to investigate Pennsylvania's extradition request for McCreary. Now, here's where things get a little involved. The Maryland governor asked for information from the clerk of the court. Well, the clerk of the court had just finished a term as Secretary of State to the governor. So there's already a political tie there. They're political allies. Second of all, and it's not clear if it was on purpose or if he genuinely didn't understand where the indictment was coming from. Because he says he's guilty of no offense recognized by the Constitution and laws of the U.S. Now, was he thinking in terms of Unionville, where there was a question about the conflicting claims? Or was he talking about Brown? Because Brown was pretty clearly a kidnapping. There was no question on that one. So he either mixed them up or he did it deliberately. It's not quite clear. Holliday declares McCreary almost invaluable to the slaveholders of the state in the arrest of runaways. So at the State House, now get this, McCreary hand delivers the clerk of the court's letter to the governor personally. Now, is Brown going to have a chance to talk to the governor about his side of the story? Obviously not. So McCreary gets to tell the governor everything, his side of the story, period, and make his case. And the governor's already sympathetic. Holliday knew that right from the beginning, because they were like mine when it came to this idea of the slave catchers from Maryland should be able to work with impunity. They should not be interfered with at all. Holliday added a postscript to his letter. McCreary has for years been active in the arrest of runaways, and the abolitionists have heaped an unlimited amount of abuse on his head. This whole persecution or prosecution has been gotten up for his destruction. I'm sure the governor, if he can consistently do so, will not grant this warrant for surrender. Were it granted, I do not believe it could be executed at this place. Now that comment was unnecessary. Holliday knew that, but he was doing that for emphasis because he knew the governor was going to be agreeing with it, but he was making it clear anyway. The governor, Philip Thomas, was an outspoken advocate for the right to recapture fugitive slaves in other states without interference. And he was already angry with Pennsylvania because of an incident a recent incident in Pennsylvania where in the eyes of the governor, a slave catcher had been thrown in jail in Huntington County, Pennsylvania, and he shouldn't have been. And there was another case in New York of a fugitive where the judge lets him go. And the governor was not happy with either of those cases, and he was already lenient in McCreary's favor. Later on, and just as a reminder, their executive, as I quoted from the Whig earlier, their executive made a demand for mercy offenders, that a man will be as idle as the wind. They will not be delivered up. And that's exactly what's happening here. Later on in the Christiana case, a treason trial, the aftermath of the Christiana incident, Pennsylvania attorneys are going to make reference to McCreary and this refusal to extradite as an example of how these Maryland slave catchers and other slave catchers were acting along the border and why it was necessary for African Americans to form self-defense leagues to protect themselves. Now, 1849, another incident. McCreary is assisted by state law this time. And he kidnaps John Jackson, a free black teenager lured from Pennsylvania by a bogus job offer. Once again, a bogus job offer. Now, this story takes a rather strange turn because evidently he's been lured into Maryland twice. He's lured into Maryland for a job, looking for a job, and then McCreary arrests him. He's fined, according to state law, he's fined $20. A man by the name of Lindsay out of the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society comes rushing down and pays his fine, and he's protected. Now, for some strange reason, it's unclear, McCreary is able to lure him back again. He said, I'll get you a job, I'll get you a place to stay. Well, he got him a place to stay. As soon as they walked past the jail, he had a place to stay. Now, here's what the rest of the state law did for McCreary. If you're the person who makes the arrest for the second arrest, this is the second time offense. It's not a $20 fine this time. It's a $500 fine. He's poor. He's desperate. He's trying to get a job. There's no way he can touch a $500 fine, and no help comes. He's to be auctioned off as a slave. Well, it turns out the arresting officer gets 50% of the proceeds. McCreary buys him at a 50% discount, takes him down to Baltimore, and sells him into the slave market. Pennsylvania attorneys will also point this out during the Christianity treason trial as an example of disregard for the rights of Pennsylvania citizens. African-American Pennsylvania citizens are not being treated to their rights. Their rights are not being respected. And also in 49, McCreary and the Massey gang attempt to kidnap Ann Brown in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, briefly, what this one's about, here's another way that free blacks were finding themselves enslaved. Ann Brown was born to a mother who had been freed by the kidnapper's grandfather, the Massey gang's grandfather. Well, they refused to recognize it, the freeing of the mother, and they refused to recognize the freeing of Ann Brown. There were cases where, they're giving up a lot of wealth. How dare you give away all that wealth? We're talking about a tremendous amount of money here, and you're just taking it away from your family and letting these slaves go. How dare you? We're not accepting that. No. So they would refuse to accept these manumissions, and in some cases, they weren't even, somebody might be freed in a will, and they didn't even bother to tell them. Because they didn't want to lose the wealth. All right, here's a case. Catherine Thompson, a fugitive slave from Cecil County, and she was a fugitive, is arrested in Philadelphia. Her freeborn infant, who was born in New Jersey, a number of former Cecil County enslaved go to Philadelphia, and they were living across the river in Camden. And there were a couple incidents where they were actually from Camden, but they were often going over to Philadelphia, and they were getting arrested then when they were in Philadelphia. And in this case, and in a couple others, George F. Alberti, Philadelphia's most notorious slave catcher and kidnapper, was involved in several cases involving accused fugitives from Cecil County, including this one. And it was a legal arrest in this particular case for the mother. The thing is, the mother didn't want to give the child an infant up. Obviously, you're a mother, you don't want to give up your infant. She held on to the infant. But the problem is, when the father said, oh, I'll take the infant, or the court said, we'll take care of the infant, the mother didn't want to give the child up. But unfortunately, that meant that the infant was also taken into slavery. And so this was a big argument. Some people, even in Pennsylvania, were arguing, well, you should not have arrested those kidnappers because they're not real kidnappers. The mother was escaped, and the child, it was okay to take the child, was a slave too. Because from the southern point of view, the North said the child is free. But in the Maryland point of view, the southern point of view, if a child is born of a slave, the child is automatically a slave. And even if the mother had escaped and was a fugitive at the time, the child is still a slave. But that was a major controversy. And I found reference to her in a slave book in Cecil County where she had been sold south. Simply said sold south. As soon as you had a fugitive, if you had caught a fugitive slave, you didn't want to keep them. You wanted to get them south, to further south. Now, in 1850, the southern states in the Great Compromise of 1850 were saying, hey, we need a stronger fugitive slave law. And the Supreme Court's already said it's a federal responsibility. We want the federal government to take over responsibility for these trials. In other words, they're saying we're not happy with the way the northern states are ruling on this. We want the federal government to do this. So the Fugitive Slave Law is passed. Now, the key features. Claimants are required to take the accused before a federal judge or commissioner. Now, notice this is an important point. They now go to a federal judge or a commissioner. If they have a claim, they grab somebody, they take them to a federal judge or commissioner. Slave catchers may request federal assistance, but they don't have to. But if they request it, they are to get it. Citizens can be compelled to assist. All the Pennsylvanians resented this. Even the ones who weren't didn't particularly have strong feelings about slavery. Just the fact that they were told that they had to engage in helping capture fugitives, they resented it. They resented it deeply. They felt that now they were being forced to act immorally. And a general description was sufficient. Oh, she's kind of round, chestnut color. Oh, he had a scar on his face. So, oh, that's enough to get you sent back as a slave for life. You may be free, but if you hit one of those general descriptions, you're gone. The critics protest the loss of states' rights. All of a sudden, the South has a different tone. Now, why did their tone change when the issue of states' rights? Well, it's not hard to figure out. They wanted to preserve slavery. They wanted to protect the institution of slavery. The critics also noticed the poor protection for the rights of accused. No jury trials, no appeals, no opportunity for a fugitive to submit evidence. The slaveholder and the agent had advantages and resources. They had complete freedom to go and get witnesses and get resources and claims, but the accused did not have those opportunities. And as I mentioned, the general description could be terribly vague. Now, there were trials in several cities. Detroit had a riot as a result of a fugitive slave trial. Philadelphia was afraid of a riot. This was the first trial of Philadelphia, and it was for a accused fugitive out of Cecil County by the name of Henry Garnett. He was arrested and tried as a fugitive for labor, supposedly named in a will. But the judge looked at the will and said, I don't think this has been properly certified. The South is a little disappointed. And by the way, historians have cited this case, but none of them ever went to the courthouse to check on the will. So I decided to travel all 8 miles to the Elkton courthouse and look up the will. He wasn't named on it. It was bogus. The one thing presented in court was totally bogus. It was just another way of kidnapping with a phony will. The second trial in Philadelphia, and the mayor had troops ready because the tensions were about ready to spark. The trial there was a lot of tension on it with the trial. Then there's, right after that, the trial of Adam Gibson. He's accused of being a fugitive named Emery Rice out of Cecil County. And over the objections of Gibson's attorneys, the commissioner rushed the hearing and ruled against Gibson. The commissioner wanted to reassure the South that they were going to get fair trials and they were going to get fugitives back. Well, there's a problem there. He rules against Gibson, but, oh, and now Bertie's involved in here. While he's waiting for his trial for kidnapping Thompson, he's loose and he's involved in this arrest. He and his accomplice take Adam Gibson, Emery Rice down to Cecil County. They put him in jail, and the slave owner is summoned, and he comes and he takes one look at Adam Gibson and he says, "This is not my slave, this is Adam Gibson. What is what he's doing here, I do not know, but he's not my slave." And the southern newspapers, Cecil Wing and all, said, "Oh, see how great our slaveholders are down here, they're honest. Say, we told you the fugitive slave law was good." The slaveholder said, "Hey, this is not him," as though every slaveholder was going to be honest. Had he not been honest, it would have been just as easy for him to say, "Well, thinking, oh, I could get somebody else then. I'll claim him." Fortunately, integrity held. Summer 1851. In July, 3 Delaware residents and Thomas McCreary conspired to illegally remove from Delaware 2 limited-term slaves, John Kinnard and Elizabeth Williams, and sell them to Baltimore slave dealers, slaves for life. In those days, if you were African American, or poor white for that matter, instead of going into a, well, no, I'm sorry. So instead of being put in jail, they're made a slave for a short period of time to somebody. They're enslaved to somebody. And you came in and you bought somebody to be your slave for a set period of time. Well, that's what supposedly was going on here. But what happens is Thomas McCreary, what they were doing, what this gang was doing is they would buy somebody to enslave for a limited period of time. Then evidently with McCreary involved, in this particular case, is they would take them down to Baltimore and then sell them into the slave market. Well, Delaware law said you weren't supposed to do that, by the way. If they were protected by the state, they weren't supposed to be taken out of the state. But that's another story. Because then what would happen is they would go back to neighbors, as Thomas McCreary points out, their neighbors would say, "What happened to your slave that you had?" "I don't know. He ran away. Couldn't find him." Yeah. They counted the province. They made it Baltimore. The Thomas McCreary stated this type of kidnapping has operated in Delaware for the last 10 years, an alarming extent. Well, what happened in this case is Kinnard, they missed the train. When the gang got to Baltimore, they missed the train. So they took the 2 captives, and put them in McCreary's house upstairs. And in that morning, getting ready for the train, McCreary tried to handcuff John Kinnard, and he resisted. And there was a bit of a struggle. The next thing you know, Kinnard's leaning out the window backwards with these 2 guys grabbing him, and Kinnard yelling, "Murderers, kidnappers, thieves!" And it draws a crowd. And well, you can't kidnap people in the middle of a crowd. So that ended that. And then the sheriff said, "Well, we better investigate." They said, "We'll send them back and find out what happened." Well, they were rescued, although actually Williams' case was a bit more complicated for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. But she had been involved in another trial earlier. Now here's what he's joining a gang in Pennsylvania or Delaware. He's helping the kidnapping them, the kidnapping. They don't want to trade, take them through Elton. And then McCreary's the one who's familiar with the Baltimore slave market. So he's taking them down. He's helping to take them down and sell them into the slave market. So this seems to be the pattern for what his activity. Now, September 1851, resistance in Christiana, Pennsylvania. Edward Gorsuch, slaveholder, follows the law precisely, goes to Philadelphia, gets a warrant, gets a marshal, does everything he's supposed to do, goes down to Christiana, and says, I'm going to take my slaves back. They're held up in a house with William Parker. William Parker was the leader of the Self-Defense League. And William Parker was just as determined that they would not be taken. So you have two very stubborn people here drawing a line. Gorsuch is very stubborn about it, to the point of not taking precautions. Some gunfire breaks out. Also, again, a number of African Americans start showing up. And they come and they gather around, or they're coming with makeshift weapons. They're getting ready for a fight. Gorsuch, however, is being stubborn. His son, his relatives, his posse is trying to draw him away. He refuses. A fight breaks out. Gorsuch is killed. Well, also on the scene at the time are two white Quakers who were concerned about kidnappers in the neighborhood to show up. Well, the marshal insists that one of them, Henway, help assist. And Henway, he doesn't do what the marshal wants. And he's trying to be sympathetic to the African Americans. And so the marshal gets it in his mind, well, there's African Americans in that house. That guy can't be the leader. It has to be a white that's the leader. Henway must be the leader of that group, and he's the one who should be charged with treason, along with a bunch of other people. About 77 people, all told, are going to be charged with treason when all this is over. It was the most violent resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Enraged southern states, especially Maryland, pressed for treason trials. He followed the law. He still gets killed. The Fugitive Slave Law gave him absolutely no protection. None. He did everything right. How dare they? Well, November, December, the Christiana treason trial. Maryland insisted it be a treason trial, which is hard to prove. Treason's hard to prove. But they insisted on a treason trial. And they even sent Maryland attorneys to join federal attorneys. Pennsylvania attorneys were providing the defense. Now, Pennsylvania attorneys refer to McCreary as an example of the borderers who abducted Pennsylvania citizens and caused the need for self-defense leagues along the Mason-Dixon line. The Maryland Attorney General expressed a one-sided interpretation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in terms of it's for the benefit of the South, period, for any slave catcher that's operating. Henway, however, is acquitted, and the other treason cases are dropped. They're returned to the state for state trials, and that never occurs. Now, overlapping the same time period, September 1851, McCreary's in debt again. All through, over and over again, just keeps falling into debt. This slave catching kidnapping was a side gig for him. So another way to make a little extra money. Some of his jobs, by the way, were local government type jobs, state jobs. Early December, McCreary abducted Elizabeth Parker, a 12-year-old girl. She was working in a household, well, African Americans in the North sometimes had to divide up their family and work for different households. Well, the mother and daughter were working together at one household when the daughter had gotten mad at the mother and decided to strike out on her own at 12 years old and had to find somebody else to work for. Well, unfortunately for her, she found somebody who was friends with McCreary, and she started working for that family. And it was right near the border. And, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. What they did is they grabbed her during the night one time, threw her into the carriage, took her right across the state line, which is only about a mile and a half away, took her down to Baltimore, claiming that she had been an accused slave. In December, shortly after Reed denounced McCreary to trial, saying that he's one of the reasons why they were having trouble along the border, a Pennsylvania posse attempted to arrest McCreary at Chestnut Level village in Lancaster County. They were unsuccessful. December 31, Thomas McCreary kidnapped Elizabeth's sister, 17-year-old Rachel Parker. And he accuses the two sisters of running away from a Baltimore owner in 1847. Although, when you look at it really close, the claims do not match up. The description and the details about the family in 47 and the ages and the Parker girls, they didn't line up in terms of detail. So it was obvious that it was not them. But here's what's significant here. McCreary did not go to a federal judge. Fugitive Slave Act, 1850, you go before a federal judge or commissioner. McCreary's sticking to his old habits. He's going straight to the state line. No judges. It's an obvious violation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, or so you would think. Now, here you have Maryland and McCreary's interests merging. Again, once again, I mean, this time more significant. Now, just to point out when the kidnapping, for Elizabeth, she's right in this area of Chester County, very close to the line. And then Rachel is here. Now, Elizabeth was kidnapped quietly. No alarm went out. For Rachel, it's a different story. Community, the alarm goes out for the community. Her employer tried to save her, and again, it's the same old story where they grab him by the collar. Well, in this case, what an accomplice of McCreary grabs him by the collar, pokes that gun in his head, and says, interfere, will blow your brains out. Kind of the same old story. As they rush down the Baltimore, McCreary and his accomplice, Merritt, rush down the Baltimore. And about 7 members of the community go rushing down after and following to try to rescue Rachel. Well, they get to Baltimore, December. Now keep in mind, Maryland is already furious. It's the anger, the hostility, and all you have to do is come down from Pennsylvania trying to reclaim someone who's been kidnapped, and the next thing you know, you're labeled abolitionist. Then the next thing you know, you are called a murderer of Gorsuch. And the next thing you know, you have an angry mob following you everywhere around as you're trying to get things right for Elizabeth Rachel Parker is partially rescued. Now, what do I mean by partially rescued? Well, she's not sent into the slave market. They're able to prove the point that she at least deserves a hearing. But until she gets a hearing, she's sent to jail, to prison. So she has to wait out in prison. Meantime, McCreary is out on bail. His friends put up money for him. He's out on bail. He's back in Elkton, working on some government job, county level job. And Miller and the rest of the Pennsylvanians that day, after an exhausting day, head to the train station. Miller, the employer, disappears. His body's found the next morning hanging from a tree 9 miles out by the train station. It's called Stella's Run. January 1852. Kidnapping trial against McCreary is derailed by Machiavellian maneuvers of a Maryland governor and the former governor. Remember Thomas McCreary? The two of them pull all kinds of stunts to try to derail McCreary's trial. One of the key surprise witnesses the former governor introduces on behalf of McCreary is McCreary's accomplice. And people buy into it because that's what they wanted to hear. On the Maryland side of it. In the spring, a group of Baltimoreans financially backed the effort to locate Elizabeth Parker. The Pennsylvania legislature provided legal support for both sisters, and the governor appoints lawyers. After 1 full year of sitting in prison, they're finally able to have her petition for freedom heard. Over 60 white, I haven't asked this for white, and I'll explain that in a moment. Although if you recall the John Jackson story, you already have a clue. This is what I'm getting at. Over 60 white witnesses, including relatives of Thomas McCreary, who were living on the Pennsylvania side of the line, traveled from Pennsylvania to Baltimore on behalf of these two black teenagers. Some of McCreary's nephews knew the Parker sisters when they were little. They used to follow the McCreary boys around when they go fishing. Her little brother. They knew them. The whole community knew the Parker sisters. They knew. No way. They were born in the community. They knew they were born in the community. No way they were escaped slaves. And you travel from, and the way I see it, this is one of America's greatest acts of compassion in the face of hostility. And they were there because Rachel and Elizabeth were members of their community and were in danger of being unjustly enslaved. African Americans from Pennsylvania would not have been allowed. African Americans obviously would not have been allowed to testify. They could have been thrown in jail, just like John Jackson, for violating state law and entering the state as non-residents. Governor Bigler requests the extradition of McCreary for kidnapping. Among his multiple reasons was the fact that McCreary had violated the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Quite obvious to those who are willing to see the facts. It was quite obvious. For those who are not willing to see the facts, well, that's going to be another story. Governor Lowe denies the request with convoluted reasoning. Here's the real reason the governor rejects it. From Maryland's point of view, allowing a Pennsylvania court to argue McCreary was a kidnapper and allowing a Pennsylvania jury to declare him guilty would undermine the South's constitutional right to unrestricted recovery of slaves in northern states. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was for northern states to strictly obey or risk shattering the Union. Southern slaveholders and their agents, on the other hand, had the option of following that law when it was helpful, or not when it wasn't helpful, or when it interfered with their constitutional right. This view of the fugitive slave law was the same argument made at the Christiana treason trial by Maryland. Now, epilogue. I had the privilege of being asked to be one of the speakers for the dedication of this plaque in 2011. They knew I was working on a book, and they invited me, and it was very nice. I was pleased to be part of this ceremony. Parker kidnapping and rescue. Emboldened by the 1850 fugitive slave law, Maryland slave catchers kidnapped Rachel and Elizabeth Parker from the Nottingham area in 1851. Rachel's employer, Joseph Miller, was murdered in a failed attempt to rescue her from Baltimore. Public outrage led Pennsylvania officials to seek the sisters' release in Maryland civil court case that secured their freedom in 1853. The forcible enslavement of two young free black women galvanized anti-slavery sentiment. And I think I made a mistake on the slide earlier. I said January 52. It would have been January 53 for the full year, but I'm not quite sure now. This was her picture, by the way, when she died this was her obituary picture in 1918. 1918, yeah. So that's it. That's the story.